Yeah, my name is Dr. John E. Byrd, John, middle initial E, Byrd, B-Y-R-D. My title is Laboratory Director at DPAA. Well, my role is to be sort of the head manager to a team of scientists. And our job in this lab is to do all the testing that we can do. We also coordinate for testing services from other labs like the Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory. And we take in those results, synthesize that data with the data we're generating here, all so that we can present really strong cases to our medical examiners for identifications. Well, there's I used to, when I first started out here, I came on as a forensic anthropologist. Before that, I'd been a college professor. And as a forensic anthropologist, I did many field deployments with the teams, our recovery teams, and I also did occasionally field investigations. And then I did, of course, laboratory work as an anthropologist, analyzing remains that had come into the laboratory. On the field side of what I was doing, I worked in many different countries. I worked in Europe, North Africa, the Pacific. I worked in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, New Guinea, Korea, both North and South Korea, extensively. And so for many years I was spending a lot of time in the field with the teams. After I became the lab director, of course, I didn't deploy with the teams anymore because I can't be gone from the laboratory that long at one time. But I had many very interesting experiences, and I would say that North Korea, working in North Korea was a unique kind of a standout experience in general, both for the types of sites we were working on and also for the experience of having to work with the North Koreans, which was unique. To say the least. And so whenever we are able to identify remains from a battle area like Unsan, it really gives me a strong sense of gratification that we did good field work in that area, that we have good lab processes that are able to solve these really difficult cases after so many years, and to have the family member come to personally escort the remains home and to be able to talk to people in the lab who worked on the project, I think it's extremely gratifying, and it kind of keeps you grounded, where you know why you're here and why you're doing this work. Because if you think about it, as scientists, we're very much deeply and intensely involved in the scientific problems that we're trying to solve. Each case is different. Each case has its own challenges. There's lots of data that has to be analyzed, sorted. We do statistical analyses. And in the midst of doing all of this, it'd be very easy to lose sight of why you're doing it. When you have a family member come and the staff who actually worked on the case get to meet the family member, and you get to see the tangible results of the hard work, it's definitely a boost to the morale. So in this laboratory, we're working with what in the forensic realm people might call residual remains. These are mostly the hard tissues that are still here with us after so many years of being missing. And this would be bones and teeth, for example. And so we have a heavy reliance on anthropology, because anthropologists that's the profession that actually studies how you can say things about a person from their bones. We also have dental records from most of our missing service members, thankfully. And so our forensic dentists here in the lab are able to compare what we see in the teeth to dental records that we have retained in the Department of Defense for all of these years. But we also use DNA extensively. The majority of our cases involve some type of DNA testing. And so that means we're taking samples from remains and we're sending them off to the Armed Forces DNA Identification Lab, where they will attempt to do a variety of DNA tests on those remains. So there's challenges to doing this analytical work in the laboratory, but there's other challenges as well. For example, to make good use of DNA results, you have to have something to compare it to. So I mentioned for the forensic dentist, they can do their work precisely because the Department of Defense saved their dental records for all these years. You know, your dentist at your local dentist's office, they probably throw your dental records out after 6 years, you know, or something like. They probably have a threshold, but not the Department of Defense. We still have dental records from World War I and before of service members. And because they had the wisdom to do that, you have something to compare to. But for the DNA testing, nobody even knew what that was before the early 1990s. It didn't exist as a forensic modality, so there was no opportunity to keep DNA samples of service members like we do today. So that means we have to find family members to compare to, and therein lies one of the big challenges that this mission has. It's one of the greatest challenges of all, and that is, how do you find close or closest family members of a missing serviceman from 1944? And the people that are responsible for doing this are our service casualty offices. So if the individual in question was an Army soldier, then the Army's service casualty office at Fort Knox, they're responsible for finding the family members of this missing soldier. And their starting point is an address that was in the personnel file from the 1940s. And chances are, as you can imagine, knowing Americans, and we move a lot, nobody's still at that address, you know, most of the time. In fact, no one who was at that address is still alive often. And so how do you deal with that? Well, what they do is they hire genealogists, professional genealogists, and we have a battalion of professional genealogists working for the various services, for the Army, the Marine Corps, the Air Force, and the Navy, to find the family members of all these missing service members. But it's not easy. Some of them we run into dead ends with, and we can't find anybody. Sometimes the service member was an immigrant, and so you lose the trail when you trace them back to their immigration, their point of immigration, and it's difficult sometimes to go back to their home country, particularly if it was, say, a communist country at the time. It's very difficult to go back and pick the trail up again. Sometimes people simply just don't have family members who are living. And it's a small percentage, but some of them just simply don't have any living descendants or close family members. In those cases, we'll reach out to cousins. You know, we can go out to second, third cousins sometimes and make use of a reference from them. But as you can imagine, when you're dealing with literally tens of thousands of missing service members, particularly from World War II, the services have an enormous burden to try to get past finding all of these family members, each and every one of them with their individual unique stories of what happened to the family, where the family moved, how they spread apart, who's a viable reference for DNA testing and who isn't. These are tremendous challenges, and you know, we always like to take opportunities like this interview to say, if there's anyone out there who has a family member who's missing from a past conflict, to reach out to that service casualty office and help us get the DNA samples that we need for these comparisons. So, for example, if you're trying to identify a set of remains, and DNA is going to play a crucial part of that identification. Let's suppose that the dental record is not very individualizing. With a lot of young service members, they're not old enough to have had cavities yet, and if you have perfect teeth, unfortunately, it's a very common dental pattern, so it doesn't distinguish you from many of your fellow soldiers. So let's suppose you have a dental record that's not very helpful in that regard, then we're going to rely on DNA perhaps to make the identification, but to rely on DNA to make that identification, we need those reference samples from the family. So then we have to wait for the Service Casualty Office to find that family and to get the samples and get the family's samples sent to the Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory. And so sometimes these are creating lag times in the work that we do. That is relatively new, right? If you go back to the late 1990s, we started to pursue identification of individuals buried as unknowns from the Korean War that were in the Punch Bowl Cemetery down the street from us here. And the first few sets of remains we brought into the lab to try to identify, we attempted to get DNA from those remains, and the DNA samples all failed. It was a big surprise, but what we learned was that the mortuary treatments they were using during the Korean War, and sometimes also during World War II, would cause problems today when you try to get DNA out of the bones. And specifically what was happening is they were giving them a chemical bath as a mortuary treatment. The chemicals included formaldehyde, and that's a chemical that we know now to be a dangerous chemical for people using formaldehyde, but we also know that it interferes with our DNA testing processes today. So it created problems, and so we went for several years throughout the early 2000s trying to figure out how can we identify these Korean War soldiers without DNA. Now, meanwhile, AFDIL, the Armed Forces DNA Lab, was trying to find ways to solve this problem on the DNA side, but on our side, we were trying to find a way to do it without DNA. And what we discovered in 2005 was that soldiers during World War II and the Korean War, the Vietnam War, soldiers throughout this era, when they joined the military and they went down to the induction station and they got their first physical, part of that process was they would have a chest x-ray shot because they were screening for tuberculosis. They wanted to make sure the soldiers and sailors and Marines joining up did not have tuberculosis when they joined. So they would shoot these images and they would get examined by a radiologist. And assuming that they passed that exam, then they would go on to service. And those radiographs were kept. And we knew from the records that they had been kept, but nobody, at least initially, knew where they had been kept. And eventually we discovered that they were in a giant warehouse in St. Louis, DOD storage in St. Louis. And we were able to get copies of these chest radiographs. They're called induction chest x-rays. We were able to get copies of these for thousands of service members that are missing. For the Korean War, for example, about 3/4 of those missing men have a chest x-ray on file with us now. What we do with the chest x-ray is we look at their unique bone shapes and sizes. We call it morphology. And we look at that bone morphology and determine what is unique about this person, about the shapes of their bones, because no two people will ever be exactly alike. Even identical twins who are mostly alike aren't exactly alike in every detail. And we want to take advantage of this fact to use that as a way of identifying people. So what we did is we took these ante-mortem or before death chest x-rays from the induction station, and then we compare them to x-rays of the chest region that we take in the laboratory now with the remains that have come in the lab, and we compare them side by side and look for things that are the same and things that are different about them.
Is it kind of like it's like a thumbprint?
Yeah. The process of comparing this induction chest x-ray to an x-ray we take from the remains is analogous to doing fingerprint comparisons. It's a very similar kind of mindset that you take when you look at the two side by side. You're looking for commonalities and differences. And there's some kinds of differences that can only be because these are not the same person. And we would call that an exclusion. When you find many, many commonalities, but no differences, at some point you may decide this is a perfect match. And when you have a perfect match, it's very, very unlikely, extremely unlikely, that the remains could be from anybody else. And so that gives you a form of positive ID.
And since it's such a lengthy process, what kind of person remains are identified each year?
Well, last year we identified over 200, just slightly more than 200 individuals. This year we're hoping to exceed that. But every year it is our goal to try to identify at least 200 of these service members. But we would like to get that number higher if we can find ways to do it while still being accurate and maintaining the quality of our work. All of this work, whether you're talking about excavating sites, studying records in the archives to figure out where someone went missing in the first place, DNA testing at AFDIL, chest radiographic comparisons we're making here in the laboratory, all of this work ultimately is being done so that this service member can have his name back and his family will know what happened to him, and the veterans that he served with. And you can't forget them, because there are many, many veterans who have buddies who are missing, who very, very desperately want them found and their name given back to them and brought home. And for all of those people who are waiting for these answers and these remains coming home with the name on the marker, for all of those people, that's why we do it, you know. And I think this nation is special and unique in the way that we have always cared about that, and we're willing to invest in it. There are a number of technological solutions that we brought to bear on the problem here in this laboratory, and then also at the Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory. The biggest win comes when you're able to develop a new test method that answers a question that couldn't be answered before. And so examples of that kind of a win would be when we developed the chest radiographic comparison procedures here that we use with the Korean War and World War II extensively. Before we had that method, oftentimes there was nothing else we could do with those remains. Now we have a method, now we have a way of finding an answer, and many, more than 100 soldiers, maybe we're getting close to 200 soldiers have been identified using that test modality, whereas if we didn't have it, they would not have been identified. At the Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory, they're constantly innovating new DNA test procedures, and one of the greatest challenges they have is getting DNA out of these old bones to begin with. And they have developed over and over again improved extraction protocols that allow them to get DNA out of bones where yesterday they couldn't, or allows them to get DNA out of a bone that's half the size of what they required in the past as a sample size. And so these kinds of innovations make a tremendous difference. And every year you can look at the successes we have, and you can determine large proportions of those successes were only made possible by these innovations that we've developed in the Department of Defense for solving these problems. 2005 is when we located the records, those antemortem images. It took us actually more than 5 years to acquire the records, image the records, and turn it into a test method. It took 5 years to develop that.
So since 2010, nearly 200 have been identified?
Yeah, nearly at least 200. And perhaps what is equally important, we like to think of the positive outcomes where you found a match. And there have been well over 100 of those, and I say getting close to 200, I believe. But what you don't think about are the value of the exclusions. And with chest radiographs today, we have now done more than 13,000 exclusions, closer to 14,000 exclusions as of today. And every time you do an exclusion with a chest radiograph and you know who isn't this set of remains, it saves you from wasting your time trying to bark up the wrong tree. We do things like we combine the work we do with dental records, chest radiographs, and DNA. So that, for example, if you have a service member who has no family reference sample, the service casualty office can't find the family. So for this service member, you can't use DNA to identify him or even exclude him from the remains, but we can exclude him with a dental record or a chest radiograph. And then there may be another service member where we do have DNA and we do have the family reference sample, but he doesn't have a dental record. So we have to use all of these things together in tandem to actually solve these cases, and that's what we're doing on a daily basis. And so it's very complicated and data-intensive work that we're doing, and it's a challenge for us in the management of the lab to synthesize this information in real time all day long, every day.